really like to maybe have a potpourri of topics that people, still have questions about, or, things that I may have mentioned but didn't go into detail enough about. So I would love you, so we'll have like some more chance just like this to talk, but if you would use the chat to type in things that you would like me to cover next time in terms of, here's your last chance to ask questions about the prayer service, the Siddur, jump in and type that in the chat. If there are other things, the only topic I haven't covered that I was planning to, and probably won't get to today, I might, is sort of how we treat the Torah and the Ark as kind of leader, master, whether that's like the temple or not like the temple. So for sure I'll cover that next time, but I would sure love to hear other topics that you would like to hear about next time, which is our last class. So we are recording and I'm going to start screen sharing. Let's see if I can get to that. Okay, so this is actually part of a talk that I gave at a conference. And so this is to sort of go back and talk about the upshot of what happened with the kind of feud that went on for hundreds of years between the Karaites and the Rabbinites. So the starting point is to say that both groups did accept that daily prayer is obligatory, both for individuals and for the community. And the issue is, do the Psalms count as prayer? And the Rabbinites, who become, sort of mainstream Judaism and, sort of dominate, they answer no. The Psalms do not fulfill that obligation for prayer. Only saying the Amidah, the prayer, Hatfilah, or the standing prayer, which is what Amidah means, fulfills the obligation, and saying Psalms does not. Now, the ones I'm going to call Karaites, kind of were the umbrella group for all of the non-Rabbinites. So if there were still sects that were around that did not follow the rabbinic mainstream, many of the times that, if they did that, it was because they were rejecting the oral law, the Mishnah. I'm ignoring that phone.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so if they were non-Rabbinites, they're basically rejecting the oral law and the whole process of Talmud, even though these denominations were very closely in touch with each other. So the Karaites knew what the Rabbinites were doing, and they knew what the Samaritans were doing. The Samaritans are also still around. So I just am going to lump them all together and just call them Karaites, because it doesn't seem like there was only one strand. And they said that the book of Psalms that is in the Tanakh, the book of Psalms that has 150 Psalms in it, is the prayer book, that is the prayer book for Judaism, and it's in the canonized Tanakh, which they all accepted, okay? And so they argue that the Amidah does not count as prayer, okay? So they're just rejecting that whole tradition. And there's a fascinating book. It's kind of a review of this polemic, the debate by Uriel Simon in 1991. And he really goes through the back and forth on it. And the Karaites are not called that early on. They come to be called that in the early Middle Ages, or, yeah, let's just call them early Middle Ages. And they, well, as I said last time, or the time before that, when Muhammad emerges and the rise of Islam and the Islamic empire, the caliphate, and its the versions of that ended up as the Ottoman Empire. So that is where different sects or different groups of denominations, it was harder for them to interact. So in many ways, when we talk about the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud, they were separated in space. And even though they were both, for a lot of the time, dominated by the Islamic rule, sometimes Israel was dominated by Christians, okay? And then it would sometimes go back and forth, and the Islamic powers controlled it up until World War I, okay? So that is why different traditions would grow up, because, in different communities that were separated in space, and they didn't have internet, they didn't have cell phones, different traditions would emerge for their communities, and they would be following their local leaders, whether they were rabbis or they were Karaite leaders. And then when they got back in touch, they would find out, oh, well, that group is doing it that way, and gee, maybe we should try that or something. And so there would be correspondence and other things. And it was a very fluid time. And it was also a time when there was no larger push to create a kind of unification, a kind of system that everybody would follow. It was more, maybe they didn't like each other, they didn't agree with each other, but nobody was, or few people were actually claiming that this sect is not Jewish. The only sect that was very clearly not Jewish was the Christians, okay, the whole strand that became Christians. Okay, so the conflict came to a head between the 10th century and the 12th century, and the reason is that is when the Crusades started. So we do know that historically, we know that the rabbis did not establish a stronghold in Jerusalem. They were in Yavne, and Yavne is north of Jerusalem. I have a cousin who lives there, so I've been there many times, and there are some ruins of the rabbinic, I guess you'd call it a yeshiva, but that's where they were. And they actually had permission from the powers that be after the destruction of the temple. They said, okay, you can establish yourselves as, leaders of this community here, and we'll grant that to you. And they did not ask for Jerusalem, they asked for Yavne, and that's where they went. And the Karaites at the time did establish themselves in Jerusalem. So the biggest population of ones who did not leave the country altogether were in Jerusalem, okay? When the Crusades started, the Christians' armies came through and wiped out Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem, and they wiped out those entire communities. And so in the leadership, in other words, of the Karaites got wiped out by the Christians. Okay, the Crusades, if you have some, local, potted history of European history, if you think about Robin Hood, all of the stories about Robin Hood, the King Richard, who was Richard the Lionhearted, was away because he was at the Crusades. And Richard the Lionhearted was the son of an Edward who was sort of he was a very early king. I'm doing this based on movies, okay, because I grew up watching all of these swashbuckling movies, and The Lion in Winter and Beckett were both about the father, Edward, who married Catherine of Aragon, who was played by Katharine Hepburn in the movie. I mean,
right.
He's the one who killed Becket, and so Canterbury, the cathedral, is dedicated to Becket's memory, and so on and so forth. So that's the time of the Crusades, and the Karaites, their leadership basically got wiped out. At the same time, this was considered the period of the golden age of Spain. And so the Moors, who were they were throughout the Mediterranean basin, but they also had a very important leadership in Spain and Portugal, and they tolerated Jews, and there was kind of a jockeying around between the three religions about, because they were translating the Bible into Arabic. That's when there was more philosophical debate among Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And so for the Jews who were living under Islamic control, there was a big push to translate the Hebrew Bible into Arabic so that the Muslims could read it and they could debate and have this philosophical discussion. The Hebrew Bible was already translated into Latin. So the Christians and Jews could already have polemics because the Jews knew the Hebrew Bible and the Christians knew what's called it's the Greek. The Greek Bible is called the Septuagint. Okay, and then Jerome, who was very early Christian, translated it from the Greek into Latin, and that's called the Vulgate. Okay, and so there were Latin Bibles, there were Greek Bibles, there was the Hebrew Bible, and so then it got translated into Arabic. And so the people who were doing this translation, there were Rabbinites and Karaites who were involved in this process. And they were doing it book by book, okay? And one of the most popular and important ones to translate was the Book of Psalms. And part of the reason for that is that the entire Islamic empire, their religion and their literature and their philosophy, poetry was one of the most important strands of that. And so they composed their own poetry. They had their own theories of poetry. And so the push to translate the Psalms into poetry was very important. I'm not sure why I'm not being able to admit Barbara. I'm just trying to let her in here. Let me, this is very strange. Something is not, all right, I'm sorry to stop here. I'm just gonna try and get back to my controls. And see, okay, she went away. All right, but hopefully she'll be back and I will let her in. Okay, so the translation of the Psalms was very important in this time period. And it's also because both the Rabbinites and the Karaites were led by the most literate and educated people who cared about text. And so everybody at this time, because there was translation and argument going on about what the Bible meant, there was a huge burst of interest in linguistics and in translation and in poetic theory and in rhetorical theory, which is my specialization. And we credit the Islamic Empire with translating and preserving some of the most important Greek and Roman texts, like Aristotle and Plato and those people, because they were very interested in these kinds of theories. And it turns out that the Christians thought that they were pagan philosophers and destroyed a lot of stuff. So don't get me started on that. So the Psalms were very important and were translated. And the point I wanted to get to is that when a scholar would publish, if you want to call it that, this is before the printing press, so all of this was done in handwriting and then copied by scribes, okay, to be disseminated. These manuscripts would include a preface in which the author, the philosopher or linguist or whoever, this leader, would take the opportunity to denounce all the others, okay? So if it was a translation of the Psalms by a Karaite, they would say, here are the Psalms, and by the way, the rabbis don't accept that these are prayers, but they're, full of it because A, B, C, D. And the Rabbinites, and so Saadia Gaon was one of the people who was translating also into Arabic. He would go and denounce the Karaites. Okay, this is apart from, the Muslims denouncing the Jews and the Christians denouncing the Muslims, and everybody was going at it. So that was what was going on between, this is a rough estimate, between the 10th and 12th centuries. But then when the Karaites' leadership got wiped out, there were still strands of them, but the rabbis kind of won out, okay? So here is, I want to show you what the Karaites said and what it meant to them that the book of Psalms is the prayer book, okay? And so, and again, so this is in that later period. This is a late, we don't have all of their texts, but these are some of the ones that survived that I could get access to in terms of, okay, Barbara is back, and I'm gonna see if I can admit her. Okay. Hi, Barbara, sorry for the trouble letting you in. Okay, so Aaron ben Eliyahu of Nicomedia, I don't know how you pronounce that, said that in his argument that the book of Psalms is the prayer book, here is the proof that he offered, that David instituted these praises and thanks with which all who wished to pray sang and recited. So he's basically arguing that ordinary people who wanted to praise and thank God, and notice that he's especially saying the praise and thanks, which, can be the Psalms of the free will offerings that I have argued are, sort of the basis of the first person Psalms. So he's saying, yeah, anyone who wanted to pray sang them and recited them. And then he goes on and says all of these Psalms were composed and made available to satisfy the needs of every seeker. Okay, so that's part of the argument, okay? And they did two things in their own prayers. So not only did they argue that David did this, and that was why the Psalms were originally written, but then they would provide different ways for individual people to be creative in using the Psalms in this current time period, meaning during the Middle Ages. And again, I don't have records. They're not records of all of these things, but there are clues to what they used to do. So they did two very interesting things. So the first interesting thing that they did was they had a time in their service for an individual to give a personal psalm. And by the way, they also had people praying at home, so it was not the case that, you had to do it in a synagogue, but, you could. And we don't know exactly how that happened, but what they said was, if you find a psalm in the book of Psalms that really captures the feeling that you're having in your current situation right now because you are sick or somebody is attacking you, then here's what you can do. So Yaqub al-Kirkasani, who was one of the big leaders, and he's 10th century, so in terms of what we have, that's considered relatively early. So if you find a psalm that lends itself to being associated, ascribed by the supplicant to himself and being adopted by him, that supplicant can inhabit it by saying, if he so wishes, he can start by saying, okay, this is a Psalm of David, or this is the Psalm that David said when blah, 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 meaning the superscript on the Psalm, and then say, on the basis of his, feeling about it, that even though these prayers are the compositions of David or Asaph or whoever, yet I admit what David admitted, and I seek what David sought. So this was kind of a little formula that you could say so that God would know that you, Mendel ben Mendel, are praying this psalm on your behalf, but God should hear it and, pay attention to it and give you what God may have given David when it was said in the temple, okay, or when David said it. Okay, so that's inhabiting a psalm. And so I think this is a great practice, all right? This is a fabulous practice. What you would need to do this on your own is to find out more about all of those psalms that are in the book of Psalms that are not in the prayer book, because as I said, the vast majority of first-person psalms that get into complaints in times of trouble are not in the prayer book, and so we're not familiar with them. Okay, so somebody remind me to get back to the there are people who read a psalm every day, okay, like doing a page of Talmud every day. So don't let me forget to come back to that, because I don't have a slide on that. But then they also did something else that was really, really creative, okay? And this is called, they were basically remixing the way hip hop artists do now. They did remixes of the Psalms, okay? And there's a Latin term for it called florilegia, which is, making a bouquet of flowers, okay, from the Psalms. And this is actually a thing that people did. And Levi Ben Yefet, who is again 10th century, and who he's describing this, okay, the worshiper may choose verses in accordance with what he desires his prayer to express. And this is the practice of all worshipers, for they glean verses expressing the divine unity from all of Scripture for their prayer. In the same manner, they seek from the Psalms verses of confession, verses of consolation, prayer, praise, and prayer, which it would take too long to detail. So what they're doing is responding to the idea that none of the prayers captures exactly the situation that any individual person finds themselves in. And, what they're assuming here, and, I do think that this is the case, that the leadership of the rabbis and the leadership of the Karaites were scribes. They were literate. They were working with texts all the time, and they were training followers and students. They were giving them literacy, okay? And we do know from the Cairo Geniza that the community in Cairo that was sticking its things into this attic of the synagogue in Cairo, there are notebooks, we call them machbarot, with students practicing their Aleph Bet. Okay, they were teaching students the Aleph Bet. Now, we don't know how much of the population was doing that, but we do know that there was Hebrew school in which this was being taught. So how many people actually took this practice, I don't know, but they made this available as a recognition that the Psalms, even 150 of them, are not sufficient to capture the circumstances that any individual person might find. And I have one example of one. Okay, so, and what's nice about this one is that it shows you all of where all the verses come from, okay? So, you know, it's in the name of God, the merciful. Okay, it is good to give thanks to the Lord is from Psalm 92. Sing praises to you. Psalm 30, give thanks to your name. God is good, endures forever. Psalm 100, for as the heavens are high above the earth, blah, blah, blah. Psalm 103, for great is the Lord. So this is all introductory, you know, calling on God and praising God and basically establishing that you, the praying person, you are a faithful follower of God. So this is the invocation part of a prayer, which is very, very common, and, you know, goes into, I will praise the Lord as long as I live. Okay, then there's this element that starts a little bit more specific. My soul is feasted as with marrow and fat, and my mouth praises you with joyful lips, Psalm 63. I will thank you forever. And so all the rest of these verses are thanks, 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 thanks from a variety of psalms. So this is a Thanksgiving psalm. And one of the things that I'm deducing about this is that, you know, the mention here of my soul is feasted as with marrow and fat, that this has something to do, the theme of this florilegium or this mixtape has to do with something to do with food, because you can see down here a reference to the person who is thirsty, the afflicted shall eat and be sated, oh, taste and see. Okay, so we can see from that, you know, it's not random. It's not a random, selection of things, that the person who put this together had a theme in mind. And so that shows how this could be done. So, you know, this is, in order to do this, you know, this, I think, could be similar to the process that the psalmists went through during the 100 years of the Second Temple period, because it could have been that this was actually composed by a scholar, not by, you know, so we can imagine somebody going to somebody who is more literate, a leader who is very, very familiar with all the Psalms, and say, I want a prayer of thanks that is on the theme of food, you know, and that the other person did it for him. And this could have been, you know, a commission, right? And one of the arguments that I make in my book about the Psalms is that I think that's what was done also in the composition of some of the Psalms, because those first person Psalms are representing people in different kinds of stances towards God. You know, either they're in a dispute with somebody else, or they're falling to temptation. There's not an enemy, but they're feeling tempted. And so you find all of these different kinds, and that, you know, that if there's a few kinds that get reused, somebody could have said, well, yeah, that I heard that one, you know, I heard you do that psalm for that person, but my situation is different in this way. And so, you know, and this is totally speculation on my part, but we have 150 psalms. I believe that there were probably thousands of versions of psalms that were actually sung in these different venues throughout the land when the Second Temple was standing. And they kept, you know, some as the ones that are great polished examples, you know, polish, you know, that they would teach to their, you know, the next generation, to say, okay, here's how you become an apprentice, you know, you're becoming a psalmist in their guilds. You know, there are different guilds of psalmists, And so they would keep their own collection, and they didn't keep all of them. Okay, some of them got kept and some didn't. And we know that some were written later than others. So I think that that's how the Book of Psalms grew. Okay, so as far as we can tell from these sources about the Karaites, there was not a lockstep practice for what they did, because they were not as unified a group as the rabbis. Okay, the rabbis knew that there was this group in Babylonia and there was this group in Palestine, and they were all corresponding with each other from all these communities around the Mediterranean basin. But they, they would write to, for example, Maimonides in Cairo, and they would write to some of these different groups, and they would give responsa to their questions. So, but what we do know from the texts that have survived is that the Karaites, there is some connection between the Karaites and the Masoretes. The Masoretes are the ones who divided up the Hebrew Bible into chapters and verses and books. And the Masoretes are the ones who put in all of the punctuation marks and put in the trope marks for chanting. And they also put in little comments where, there's these little things, that in the versions of like a tikkun that somebody would use to learn the Torah portion, there are sometimes little notes, and you can see those also in our modern Chumash. And there are some people who argue that many of the Karaites were people who followed or were part of this Masoretic community, and they were around sort of from the 7th to the 10th century. What we do know is that they chanted the Psalms following the Masoretic pronunciation and the trope marks. So there are trope marks associated with all of the books in the Hebrew Bible, not just the Torah, okay, and that they chanted them that way, okay. They also were pretty strict on following the text and musical correctness for doing the Psalms, okay. And it's possible, I don't know if this actually makes sense, that at least one scholar of these two down here who I'm citing says that those practices may also have applied to the Florilegium when they would compose one of these mixtape psalms. And so the implications of this are that clearly, and this is what they said they were doing, they were taking the Psalms as the liturgy. They included they did have kind of a recommended sequence of Psalms where they had hymns, some of the communal hymns to start off with, that everybody was, these are the communal ones. And they included the Shema, they included Torah reading, they included other pieces of scripture like the 10 Commandments or, the Song of the Sea. And so some of these things were interspersed. And there were also places where people could do personal psalms, and we don't know how that went, okay? And so we know that apart from these hymns that everybody was singing, that they encouraged or gave people the opportunity to choose psalms that reflected their current status, that reflected the situation that they were in. And I think that as a consequence of this, that psychologically, the Psalms were a resource for these communities for identifying with one of the characters in the text, particularly David, but not only David, as, that I, in 13th century France, I'm identifying with this character in the Bible because my Florilegium or my prayer, whatever I can take a verse of scripture out of that person's story and say that like that other person. And I think that the Psalms then also are modeling what kind of relationship they had with God, that kind of personal relationship. And that relationship, and this is one of the main arguments I make in my book, is not an obedient, happy camper. That it's very clear in the Psalms that the Psalms are challenging God and saying, God, if you don't rescue me, you are guilty of injustice because I'm innocent and I am faithful. And if you do not come through for me, your reputation is going to suffer. Okay. And those are the kinds of challenges that, if you are a regular service goer and listen to the Torah, that's exactly how Moses is challenging God all the time. Okay. And Abraham challenges God in that way when, at Sodom and Gomorrah and so on. And so that kind of relationship is being fostered by this use of Psalms. Okay. Now, the rabbis don't. Okay, they have ruled out the Psalms. They are not only saying that the only prayer that satisfies, okay, to go back to where I started from, they are not only saying that the Psalms don't count as prayer, but saying a psalm does not fulfill the mitzvah that is incumbent on you every day to pray. And so if you do not say the Amida is the only thing, and saying it at these times in these services, okay, either at home by yourself or with a minyan in the synagogue, that fulfills the obligation, but not saying psalms, okay? So, okay. Okay, so here's what happens with Sa'aja Gaon. This is why, oh, that's my phone. I'm going to just mute that. So what Sa'aja Gaon does, so here's who he is. He is a big leader of the Babylonian rabbinic group. And there's a long line of these. And anybody who studies these will tell you that they were far more authoritarian than the Palestinians. They were far more doctrinaire, okay, and rigid in what they said was okay to do. So if you compare the Babylonian Talmud to the Palestinian Talmud, the Babylonian one tends to be more restrictive, let's just say, okay, and the writing style is different. So he was involved. He's the one who created the first, as I said, the first written down prayer book, the first manuscript that got widely copied. And part of the reason it did not last as much is that every time it got adopted and the scribes in the community would be copying it by hand in manuscript, they would change things. And so there are, it was the basis of many different Siddurim, but every community kind of changed it up, all right? And it was written in Judeo-Arabic, so there was a lot in Hebrew also, but it was not in a form that was likely to last because it was not printed, okay? And he also translated many biblical texts, and he created many of these polemics in the forward to his translation. He carried out huge arguments, and sometimes just in manuscripts that he would just send around, in which he saw the Karaites as a huge danger. And so his community did. And what this suggests is that the Karaites at this time, and so this is before the Crusades, they were numerous enough and they were authoritative enough to seem a threat to the rabbis. And they are a threat because they're saying, where do you get off with this oral law? Where do you get off with making up your own prayers? We are the ones who are following the the Tanakh. We are the ones that are following what's in the Hebrew Bible. And so it got to be more and more heated. And it was during this time period that it gets, because we have texts now preserved from this period, we see the arguments back and forth. And the Karaites also had their polemics against the rabbis. Okay, so Saadia Gaon, when he creates his prayer book, and this may have been one of the reasons that he did create the prayer book, all written down instead of oral, is that he prescribes what you can and cannot do, even though his prayer book does contain some psalms, because it was clear that there were psalms being sung, okay? He creates these rules, okay? He puts out these rules for when you can and cannot say a psalm and how psalms may be performed. And here's what he did. It's really fascinating. Okay, he was also very well organized. So he would set these things out. He would put out these categories of restrictions. Okay, so not all of the psalms have superscriptions, but a lot of them do. So the first thing that Saadia makes up as a rule, as a law, is if the superscription says that this is a psalm that was sung by the Levites when they went to the temple, no one but a Levite is allowed to read it. Okay? Everyone else is forbidden to do it. And then he says, even if you are a Levite, you can only do it under these circumstances. Okay? So he says, okay, the superscriptions, apart from attributing it to a person or to the prayer leader or something like that, many of them mention musical instruments in the superscription, on the lyre, okay, or on the other musical instrument. So he says, if the psalm designates a lyre, you may not perform this psalm unless you're using a lyre following the melody that it says, which we don't know, because even at that time, even in the 10th century, we know that the terminology referring to the musical instruments and what they mean was lost. It was already lost. We don't know what they mean. Okay, so he's saying, well, it's too late. We can't do them anymore. Okay, so not only the melody, but the instrument. And he goes so far as to say that if someone changes the instrument in order to do a psalm, that person has sinned. Okay, so it can't be used for a prayer by anybody. And it says the psalms may only be sung on the designated time. So when it says a prayer for Tuesday or a prayer for Wednesday or for the new moon, he's saying it's not just that, of all of the times it was said, this one was especially said on the new moon. No, it can only be done on the new moon. Now, so you're getting the flavor here of how rabbis would take things and run with them, okay? So the old saying about the rabbis is that if there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way, okay? So this is setting the halacha so that you may not do these prayers, these psalms in any particular way. And by the way, and this is really just a side note, this is how it came to be that women were not required to do everything that the men were, but they were not barred from it for many, many hundreds of years. And then that got interpreted as, no, it's not just that they're not permitted. It's not just that they're not obligated, it's that they are forbidden to do it. Okay, so this is a dynamic that happens in rabbinic practice. Okay. Oh, so Melanie is asking, did they use other psalms? Yes. Okay. So um, let me finish this page, and then I'll go back and answer. I'll take a look at the chat and answer some questions. Okay. So the other thing that he did was, and this is, he didn't even need any of the other ones. Okay. Because he did this. The book may not be read except in the temple in Jerusalem. In other words, a rebuilt third temple. Okay. He did allow people, so what he said was, it can be read. So if you just want to treat it as a book of poetry, or as a book of prophecy, or if you want to treat it as, oh gee, I'm bored, I don't have anything to do, I think I'll read the Psalms, you may do it. Okay, but you're not using it to fulfill the obligation of prayer. Okay, so these restrictions, okay, are, okay, so he has Psalms in the prayer book. Here's a listing of all of the Psalms that the rabbis, and this is not even complete because there are little bits of Psalms in other places, okay, where you might think this Psalm would be appropriate. So here are all of the Psalms in the prayer book, okay, and Ashrei is not just, it's not one Psalm. It's actually a piece of Psalm 144 and it's Psalm 145, and then it's got this thing tacked on to the end, and this, so it's kind of a florilegium in a way. And so now is a good time to answer Melanie's question. Throughout the period of time after the temple was destroyed, and even before the temple was destroyed, people were writing Psalms. Okay, so there are many hymns and psalms in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Essenes, who, took off and lived in this little hermit community in the caves, they were writing Psalms, and we have texts of them from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know that there are other Psalms, and what they got to be called is not necessarily a psalm. That's the basis for what we call piyutim, okay? Because throughout this period, especially with the interest in poetry with the rise of Islam, and that's the 7th century, everybody was writing poetry and they were singing things. And so, there are a lot of texts that, in medieval manuscripts that were handed down to us. And we keep a few piyutim. And are some people who believe that the text of the Amida and the text of most of our other prayers were written and got to be so popular that there were lots of manuscripts of them, and then they got gathered up by Saaja and others and put into the prayer book. Okay, so where did the text of the Amida come from? It could easily have come from people who created text to go with the blessings. As I think I said, I hope I said this clearly, that I think that in its skeletal state, the Amida is just these 18 or 19 blessings, and that people could fill in their own text around them. And that's true of the rest of the prayer book as well. So, and I just want to make sure I say this before we end, so that this gets said, is that you'll notice that we have, in formal terms, and the rabbi will say this, there are 2 prayers that we say before the Shema, okay? And there are 2 blessings that we say before the Shema, okay? But in the prayer book, it looks like there's 5 or 6, okay? One of the prayers we say before the Shema is a prayer for God as the creator of the universe, okay? the creator of the universe, meaning like the stars and the sun and the moon. But our prayer book, our Siddur, has like 3 of those. We don't have to say all 3 because we need to say the blessing, and it would be possible to pick and choose from the ones that are there. So the El Adon, for instance, that song, El Adon, I'll call him, that's one, but there are other ones that are right there. But what has happened in terms of the dynamic with this process of accretion and then the sanctification of everything that's printed in the prayer book is that we say all 3 of them. We, all 5 of them, or all of the different versions of the creation prayer, we say all of the versions instead of choosing one. Okay. And another place where you can see that is that the Sim Shalom. So we know that there are 2 versions of the Sim Shalom, one that we do in the evening service, one that we do in the morning service. And so there are traces of the flexibility that there used to be in the prayer book, that now, especially since the 1500s, when the Orthodox, with their payas and their hats, and they said, okay, this is it, everything, we're freezing it, this is what is now halacha, it has to be this and nothing else. That's when all of this fluidity started draining out of the system. Okay, so of these, the only thing that, these 2, the Hallel, as I said last time or the time before, seems to have been performed as a unit from the time of the Maccabees on, so that's during the Second Temple period. And to whatever extent the superscription that says this psalm was the Tuesday psalm, this is what they read, okay, on Tuesdays, this is what they chanted, those are clues to what was going on beforehand. Okay, so here are some of the implications, and I'm almost out, so then we'll get to just open this up and talk about it. So what happens in here? Okay, if you look at the Psalms that are in the preliminary service called Pesuke de Zimra. Pesuke de Zimra means verses of prayer, verses of song, okay? And so it is these Psalms, and what you can see here is we have a few individual Psalms, okay, and then we do 92 and 93, and then we do all of 146 to 150. Okay, Kabbalat Shabbat it's 95, 29, and 92 to 93. It's broken up into pieces, but we get a couple in a row. And then there's this thing for the Psalms to say during the afternoon service on Mincha. This is 14 Psalms in a row. Okay, and this is 5 Psalms in a row. Okay, so here's where I want to get to. Obai, if you have to go to Israel, have a safe trip. You can watch the end of this in the video if you want to watch it. Okay, that when you chant Psalms in a sequence like that, what happens, and this is true of Hallel, Hallel mixes together Psalms that were actually composed for different purposes. So there's a Thanksgiving Psalm in the middle of Hallel, okay? And there are first-person Psalms in there, and then there are communal Psalms of prayer. And so by mixing them together and singing them one after the next, you don't even recognize, you may not even recognize, oh, the person who really wrote this, or this one by itself could be a Thanksgiving Psalm. It's separate from all these other things. We don't pay attention to that, okay? And we don't pay attention to the actual content of the Psalm, because the Thanksgiving Psalm that is in Hallel is for somebody who was in a particular situation, but we don't really recognize that that's only one situation of thanks. We don't see some of the other ones, okay? And so, as I said, that if we do pray the Psalms as prayers, we're not identifying with the speakers or with, I'm not saying an identifiable named speaker, but what the Karaites did when they picked a psalm and they said, okay, this one expresses my situation and I feel what the person felt, right? There are some that just say for the prayer leader, we don't know the name of that person, or there may not be a scriptural identified person, but what you're doing is identifying with somebody who lived during the biblical period, and you're seeing those people. So if you want to say we identify with the dysfunctional family practices of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all their kids, and we identify with them as human beings interacting with God and with all these trials, that is heightened by also taking the people in the Psalms, the speakers in the Psalms, as people who are modeling how we can behave around God and how we deal with trouble, okay? And so what the prayer book does, what the Siddur does, because it only has a very few first-person Psalms, it exposes us to the hymns that are the least prayer-like in terms of an individual praying, okay? Mm-hmm. So what the rabbis do, and here I'm referring to this, okay, how are they really using the Psalms in the prayer book? How are the rabbis using the Psalms? They're using them as warm-up exercises, okay? They're using them to set the mood. And if you listen to the rabbi, he's actually saying this, we're now getting into the mood for saying the Amida or something like that. So the serious prayer is the Amida, okay? They do continue, this is one of the most important things that they do, and they still do this. They do remind us of the cultural values that are basic in the Tanakh, okay? But they're deflecting attention away from the text and the actual situation of use of the Psalms. And the rabbis do not insist on chanting the Psalms with the trup, okay, that is assigned to them by the Masoretes. So we don't adhere to the Masorete accenting. We can sing, and on Friday night we do, and I actually love it, the fact that we sing all of these Psalms with all these different melodies. So we follow Karlbach. Karlbach has all of these wonderful melodies for the Psalms and actually for a lot of the prayers. And so some of those allow us to, make it easy to pronounce the Hebrew according to the Masoretic accenting, and some of them don't, but we don't pay attention to that, okay? And the proof of that is that the pronunciation is not corrected, where the rabbis insist that what does have to be corrected is chanting from the Torah during the Torah service, and that's why there are gabbais up there to correct the person. And you don't correct the singing, okay? As a gabbai, I can say this, and Sigrid knows this as well. You don't correct the trup. You don't correct the
blessings before.
No, not the blessings, and you don't correct the Haftorah, even though it comes from the Book of Prophets and it has the trup marks or the pronunciation. We don't care about that. The rabbis don't care whether you get that right. The only thing that counts is the portion that is assigned by the Masoretes for being read that week. Okay, that portion and triennial cycle. So you do correct the pronunciation of the words, but you don't correct the singing.
Interesting.
Okay, so that's the last thing that I have. Okay, so if you wanted me to go back to this, I will. But what I would like to do for the next 10 minutes is just, if you want to type comments into the chat, you may. If you have questions about what I've just said, okay, I want to take a look and see what you're saying. You can unmute yourself, wave a hand, But I want to look through the chat. So Rose is asking, why is there so much praise of God? Why does God need our praise? That's a great question. All right, I can give you a short answer, but that's one I might want to talk about next time. And basically, I make the argument in my book that praise counts as currency with God. Praise is the coin of the realm with God, okay? And that is actually a step of progress away from imagining God as somebody who might need to eat something, or who has a nose and is looking for something that smells good from the incense in the sacrifices and all of that. Okay, so
yeah. I
yeah,
mean, I'm thinking that it's kind of like anthropomorphizing God and saying, because I mean, we know even in Africa now, the chief men, the rulers or whoever, they actually have praise sayers in their court, and that's their job, is to say, and even in Washington, D.C., we have this storm.
okay, yeah.
So it's to say, so I think that maybe they were saying, like we say, God is our king, that we imagine that God would respond and insist on being praised,
Right.
as the kings would. I don't know. That's what I'm thinking.
So here is another reason why it's such a shame that the first person Psalms are not more familiar, because the Psalms in the Tanakh are different from the prayers of the surrounding Canaanites, Hittites, etc., in the fact that our Psalms, the only people who say Psalms are people who are presenting themselves as innocent. They have not committed a sin. Because if they were sinful, they would be giving a sin offering, and they would go to the priest with the sin offering, and whatever discourse around it was not recorded. If you're going to say a psalm, that's because you're innocent. And so it's the Psalms that challenge God. It's the Psalms that say, I'm innocent, and if you don't rescue me, you are guilty of injustice. And so this relationship, where it's a two-way street, the covenant is a two-way street, and God is being expected to uphold God's part of the bargain, is expressed in the Psalms. The praise part of it is to say, I am faithful and innocent, and you are my God. Remember the covenant that binds us.
You're supposed to. Well, and in one of the prayers that we say on Yom Kippur is, look to the Brit.
Right, exactly.
Look to the Brit, or it's like, I think I sent you the joke, he had a hat.
Yes.
I mean, that's encompasses the joke. And if you guys are interested, you probably are familiar with the joke about the grandmother and the little kid, he had a hat. Look it up on YouTube. Okay. And that's the easiest way to see the joke. But that's basically, kind of a plea to say, why are you doing this to me?
Right.
Come on, innocent child.
Right.
And at the end, he had a hat.
Right. Okay. It sounds like a Shaggy Dog story. Sigrid asked in the chat, Psalms 151 to 155 that are used in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Yes, those are known. They, I think they're called Psalms of Solomon or something like that. I don't know. But there are lots of Psalms around at that time, okay? So there were texts, and I mentioned this before, that there are books that we know, books or manuscripts, whatever you want to call them, that were written by Jews, okay, like the books of Maccabees, okay, that were written by Jews during the Second Temple period and just thereafter, that were not included in the Tanakh because the Tanakh was closed. And it was closed during the period of the rabbis because the rabbis debated whether the Song of Songs should be in the Tanakh, okay? And when I say rabbis, it's the community that was around that was not only the ones I'm calling rabbinites, because if the Masoretes included the people who also became the Karaites, this is not only the people who grew into the rabbinic tradition over time, but the community that was somehow in charge of redacting the Hebrew Bible made decisions, and their debates are recorded in the Mishnah and the Talmud.
So are there other numbered Psalms even past 155? They're called Psalms?
I don't know who gave those the numbers 151 to 155. I don't know who gave those the numbers. I would have to look that up and find out, okay? But they certainly, okay, I can also tell you that the numbering of the Psalms, I do know this for sure from my research, that the division of Psalms into 150 numbered ones was fluid for a long time, because there are scraps of manuscript around that divide the Psalms up differently than we do. And the Christian numbering of the Psalms is different from the Jewish numbering of the Psalms. And sometimes there are pieces of Psalms that there's some debate about whether this piece belongs in the previous Psalm or the following Psalms. And there's even some debate about whether the superscriptions are really subscriptions, whether they are referring to the one below them or the one above them, okay? So somebody made a decision at some point, and that's what we got stuck with. But there's lots of records of fluidity during this period. So I don't know who numbered those 151 to 155. So we have about 5 minutes, and apart from other questions that you might want to chime in with, I would like to hear some things that you would like me to cover next time, which is our last class. So I have a few things that will not take up the whole time. So, and I've got it that you do want to hear more about Ashrei, which is a fascinating story. So I will tell you more about Ashrei. But if there are other things, anything, this is the sort of stump the band. Anything else about prayer, the prayer book, services, weird things we do, why do we do this? And by the way, if you can't think of them right now, you're welcome to email me during the week.
Davida, you mentioned about the women. I'm just curious. So if you would elaborate more when it became unpopular for women to participate and how it became, why did it take so long till it was popular again?
Why it took so long is because when the halacha was frozen in the 1500s, there were already enough arguments in the Talmud that women shouldn't be doing these things. Okay, and when Joseph Cairo said, okay, the halacha goes this way, all he was doing, that's the majority vote. But before Joseph Cairo did that, it was okay for communities to decide to follow the minority vote or a minority position. It was okay. All right. So there's a woman, a teacher, I think she's retired now from JTS. Her name is Judith Hauptmann.
She came to Austin, I remember.
She did. She gave a great talk, and she has a book exactly on this point. And she goes through all of these Mishnahs and things that say it's perfectly okay for women to do this. And I'll just tell you on one foot what the bottom line is. And this is going to drive you nuts. The reason why women should not do these things is because if there are able-bodied and educated men in the room when it's being done, it will seem embarrassing. It will be embarrassing that there's not a man to do it. And
Oh,
God
lovely.
help me, that is the reason. It's only to save their pride.
That's the mother in her. The instinct is to make your little boy feel special, the princess of Israel.
That is admitted by the rabbis in the Mishnah. And this is exactly the same reason, if we start looking at why do the Taliban and other Islamic extremists require women to cover themselves up? It has nothing to do with the women themselves. It's because the men are so weak. The men are so lustful. They are so oversexed that if they see a woman and her hair is uncovered, they will not be able to control themselves, and they will sin by raping this woman.
Lovely.
Why women can't drive and have to cover up.
Well, that's like the reason for the shidel and everything like that. It's the same thing. It's because men, they just can't
help themselves. Poor guys. They just can't help. Sorry, Mike.
Well, that's because of that's why in the Orthodox, the women can't do things in mixed company, but they're not restricted from doing it when they're with other women, because
they are.
Go right back to that.
Because the ultra-Orthodox are saying they're forbidden to do it even on their own. And some modern Orthodox are saying they're forbidden to do it on their own. They will not allow, some Orthodox will not allow women to have a Sefer Torah for their own minyan without any men around. They will not allow.
So Davida, on a little more lighthearted note, if there was social media, Twitter and Facebook, back at the time that these arguments was going on, do you or anybody think the rabbinics would have still won the argument, because they are circulating at that time very slow documents around, and if you would have more instantaneous feedback, could the non-rabbinics may have made the day?
The
hypothetical question here.
Yes. Well, I have to say that the Karaites came, because these were all kind of scholarly, learned people, and they were paying attention to what they were doing. A lot of the practices that the rabbis were prescribing came to be adopted more and more by the Karaite communities. So well before the 1500s, because the rabbis were doing a lot of stuff that was very useful for dealing with circumstances that hadn't come up. When I gave the example of the swordfish or the balloon in the car, you have to have ways to interpret the scripture to deal with your current circumstances, and the rabbis were expert at it. And the Karaites, even though they didn't want to, they argued things out and began adopting some of the same tendencies. And the Karaites also had some of the rigidity of, I'll just say, the Shaker community, the ones that they boxed themselves in to such an extent that you just
they went extinct.
Yeah. Okay, so that tendency was already showing up. And then when they got killed off in the Crusades and they lost their leadership, that's why they are still in small numbers. So I think that there would have probably been a lot more diversity. I think that the rabbis were onto something very valuable in terms of having more say-so over holidays and ways of living and ways of dealing with the powers that be. So they were going to be influential anyway, but maybe there would have been even more diversity.
Hey, Davida?
Yeah.
Could you, maybe not in the context of this class, I would be interested in finding good resources to talk to kind of compare and contrast, as they say, the codification of the liturgy and with the Conference of Nicaea,
Oh,
Christianity, which
yeah,
is much the same thing, but it occurred like in the 400 or 500s.
right,
Constantine,
right.
where the fathers of the church did much the same kind of thing as far as saying,
Oh, yeah.
in what was out of the liturgy, what was in, what was out of
Yeah.
the books. So if you have any information about that, I think that would be a
Okay.
very fascinating thing. And I'm wondering if
There
there
are books on these things, and it's kind of infinite. The amount of stuff that's out there is really huge. But I'll prefer for next time, I'll put together a couple of books that I do recommend that talk
Okay.
about some of this stuff that are well written and not overly.
Yeah, because I'm not aware of other religions, and I'm not aware if in Islam they did the same thing.
They
But
did. They did.
But in the non-Abrahamic religions, I don't think that really happens. Maybe.
Oh yeah, it does. I mean, it's inevitable. The religion where we know the most and the least in some ways is Mormonism, because it's within the last couple hundred years, and it all happened in front of everybody until a lot became secret. But it's inevitable that there are going to be these kinds of things. And in Protestantism, what happened was, instead of having these debates, or they do have the debates, should we ordain gay people and so on and so forth. But Protestants, they just break off into a whole new sect, they just walk out. And so they just proliferate different sects. And, Catholics have a few that, they're still considered Catholic, but they're a fringe subgroup of Catholics, and that's more like us in the Jewish realm. And in the Islamic world, there's the main groups, the Sunnis and the Shiites, but there's also other littler ones. And even within the Shiites and even within the Sunnis, there are ones, and they're all over exactly the same kind of discussion. So.
But Davida, along with that, is that when you could say that the Christian prayer psalms numbering became different from the Hebrew numbering of the psalms? Because I was just curious how that happened.
Yeah, I mean, that when they created the New Testament and they decided what was in there, and they renumbered everything, and they renumbered the 10 Commandments too. So, Anyway, so let's call a halt. If you need to go ahead. And please email me if there are other things you want to cover next week, and I'll send out a reminder email. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Davida.
Thank you.
Thanks, Davida.
Thank you.
Bye.